Great, so we're convinced. Our best bet at happiness lies in being virtuous. But how do we do it? Aristotle thinks that first we have to note what virtues are, and he thinks that if you look at the list of virtues, you'll see that they're dispositions, that is, habitual tendencies to act or think in certain ways. If you call someone courageous, it's because you notice that she makes a habit of conquering fear to respond in smart, helpful ways when it's called for in difficult circumstances. If you call someone witty, it's because you've noticed that they have a habit of making people laugh in clever ways. So when we're trying to develop virtues, we're trying to develop dispositions. But which behaviors or thoughts count as courageous or temperate or benevolent ones? We're going to take a close look at the virtues and see what we can find. First, they're pretty complicated. Take courage again. It's not enough just to get over fear in the face of something frightening, right? There are times when lacking fear is more likely to get you a special spot on Jackass or win you a Darwin Award than it is to help you count as courageous. So you have to use your faculty of reason to determine that your actions are necessary and likely to be helpful. This can work lightning fast, especially if you've made a habit of this kind of thinking, but it has to have happened. Or you might be conquering fear just to do something really dumb, not something courageous. What are you using your reason for when you're displaying courage? Well, you have to be assessing this situation to determine a bunch of stuff. In this circumstance, is it more helpful to risk a lot, or is it actually more helpful to risk less? Say that you witnessed a car accident, to use a very, very rare and extreme example, and there are no trained rescue personnel around. And you have reason to believe that the people in the car need help to get out, and they are in immediate danger. In that circumstance, courage might demand that you risk yourself to go help get them out of the car. But what if there are trained personnel around? Then, if you go rushing in trying to help, you're much more likely to be in the way. So the exact same behavior is foolish in one circumstance, brave in another. What if you don't have any reason to believe that the people are in immediate danger? If you go rushing in and try to drag them out of the car, you could actually hurt them much more by moving them. So again, depending on the situation, the same behavior might be foolish in one circumstance and courageous in another. Or what if you're a single parent with 2 little kids dependent on you? Risking your own life is much more morally ambiguous if you also are risking the well-being of dependents who can't choose to risk their own futures. To take a completely different example, what if it came out a few weeks from now that one of the NFL players who knelt during the protest didn't really give a damn about any of the issues, but just wanted to impress his girlfriend? Would you consider him courageous once you found that out? So there's quite a lot involved in exhibiting virtue, and much of it has to do with finding the right balance among the spectrum of options in that circumstance. So Aristotle says, if we think about the virtues, we see that they're all examples of a very particular balance between extremes. And if we break down that balance in detail, we will see that virtuous behavior consists of, I have split this up into 6 things. He does not actually number them. The first thing is using your reason to determine the right balance between extremes at the right time, toward the right thing, for the right end, and in the right way. And that has 2 parts. The first part is that the agent must be in the right state, and also that you must get pleasure from, or at least not hate, the virtuous action. First, let's talk about what Aristotle means by a balance between extremes. He thinks that every virtuous action finds the right place to land between two attitudes or two behaviors that constitute either an excess of the behavior or attitude or a deficiency of the behavior or attitude. What does that mean? Courage, for example, is the right balance between recklessness, which is excessive fearlessness in the face of danger, and timidity, which is a deficiency of fearlessness in the face of danger. We talked a bit about temperance earlier. Temperance is the right balance between self-indulgence, which is an excess of pleasure-seeking, and insensibility or boorishness, being a bore, which is the deficiency in pleasure-seeking. And let's take one more example in depth. Take fairness. Fairness is the right balance between toughness and indulgence. Say you have a friend and this person was having problems and they messed up their life pretty badly, but they're getting their life back together now. They've recognized their problems, they're working on their problems, and they need a hand to get themselves back together. Maybe they need a place to stay for a few weeks. Toward that person, at that time, you might determine that fairness consists of helping them out. But if you had a friend who'd had the same problems, but had never owned up to their own role in their problems, they've never taken any steps to try to help themselves. We all know people like this, right? Everything that goes wrong is someone else's fault. They refuse to ever take a look at their own behavior. They won't accept any help that might actually fix things. They just seem committed to running themselves into the ground. Fairness in that case might consist in refusing to help. Now let's talk about this idea that you have to do things in the right way in order to be virtuous. There are two parts to this. First, we're alluding to what we talked about above in our example of courage. If you do something not because you want to do the courageous thing, but for some other motivation, you don't count as courageous. In our example, a player took part in the protests, which would strike many of us as courageous, but didn't do it because it was the courageous thing to do, but rather to impress his girlfriend. So, we lose a lot of respect for his action. So you have to want to do the virtuous thing, and you have to want to do it because it's the virtuous thing. The other part is kind of like mastery level virtue. When you actually do have the habit of the virtue, it has become a disposition in you. You don't hate doing the virtuous thing. In fact, because it's a disposition, at the time you hardly even think of it consciously. It's become like an automatic response, where most of the processing happens without your deliberately willing it. Aristotle thinks that you will find a lot of satisfaction in having that value, even if it's not a joy right at that moment that it's happening. Remember that he repeats frequently that human flourishing is a long-term thing. As it works in your life over the long term, it will be part of that deep, profound satisfaction that pervades your life as a whole, even though there will be tough spots and rough patches. Okay, so this balance, using reason to find the right balance between extremes in the particular circumstances, doing so deliberately and making a habit of it, is what Aristotle calls the intermediate. Be careful though, the intermediate is definitely not always right in the middle between the two extremes. Notice how in our fairness example, in one situation we were much closer to the generosity, forgiveness, indulgence end of the spectrum. In the other example, we were much closer to the other end, to the toughness end of the spectrum. To give another example, there might be situations of great injustice in which great anger is called for. Okay, well, this is all well and good, but for most of us, this is precisely the problem. We don't know where we should land between extremes in difficult situations. So how do we figure it out? Aristotle says that people of good character have the judgment to find the intermediate. So how do we become a person of good character? That's what we'll explore in the next lecture video on developing the habits of virtue. As always, review this video in your notes. Email me at cboyle@contracosta.edu if you have any questions, and I will virtually see you for the next video.